When my youngest was a toddler, I could not take him into a public restroom without him having a complete meltdown. He was terrified of the self flushing toilets. At the time, I didn't know a whole lot about sensory preferences or why my child was freaking out because the toilet would flush on its own. But now looking back, I realize there was a whole lot going on that his brain did not find safe when he went into a public restroom. We ended up using play and figuring out a way to help him still go. I called the self flushing toilets robots. He would ask, "Are there robots?" "Yep, there's robots. The toilets are robots." And we figured it out. Then we also noticed that he was, quote unquote, a very picky eater and would not even touch foods to try them or taste them. He still, for the most part, is like that, but he is starting to expand his choices with food and will sometimes at least try something that is mixed or blended or doesn't look like the way it grows from the ground or grows from a tree. If any of this resonates with you, maybe you have a child that is labeled as being a picky eater or can't handle loud noises, even if they seem like they make a lot of loud noises, or maybe there's some other sensory things going on. If you haven't checked out episode 13, that's the first episode of this series where I dive deep into what I call our sensory cups. This episode, we're going to discover even four more sensory systems, and it might start helping you make sense of your own behaviors or your kids' behaviors. And don't forget, I have a sensory profile sheet that I highly recommend downloading and filling out for each person in your family so you can start identifying what their sensory preferences are. Okay, let's get to it. If you didn't catch the last episode, episode 13, I highly recommend you start there. I dive into what sensory systems are, how a lot of behavior is actually just our sensory preferences showing up. Say you feel touched out or you struggle to stay calm with your kids and you keep yelling even though you don't want to yell. It could be connected to one of your sensory systems communicating to you that it is way too full. Or, especially with kids, we see that their cups are very empty and they're reaching for input. They're needing to slam their bodies into things, including other humans, which isn't always the safest thing to do. And I love using this sensory cup analogy where, with all of the eight sensory systems, yes, we have eight, not just five, as you probably learned growing up with our five senses. We have either a super teeny tiny cup where it doesn't take a whole lot of input before we start to freak out. Our brains start to freak out. It wants to get to safety. We need to process. We need to be able to take a break from whatever it is. Or we have a really, really large cup that requires a ton of what's called input. We need a lot of that. That is what we call our sensory seekers. Or you might just have an average size cup and you can handle some things sometimes, you can't other times. And it's pretty what's called integrated in your brain. Your brain can process all of this sensory input, all of these messages that your nervous system is constantly scanning for. It can process them in a way that does not impact your behavior or impact your kids' behavior. Today, we are going to cover our visual sense, our auditory, our olfactory, and our gustatory. You may not be familiar with olfactory and gustatory. No worries, I gotcha. I'll explain what those are. This is really great to explain to your kids too. My middle son has a lot of sensory quote unquote challenges. His brain requires a ton of input in certain areas, and then he can't handle much input in other areas. I started teaching these words to him, these systems to him at a very young age. And now at 14, he can advocate for himself. He can verbalize what's going on. This is too much for me. Or I need to go slam my body into the beanbag because I can feel that I need to push something. Or I mentioned in the last episode, because we talked about our proprioceptive systems, our vestibular, that's our body in space, and also our tactile. And we did these things called pushies. He'll still tell me, hey, can I just push you? Yes, you can in a safe context. We both know what that means. And he's able to get the input that he needs. Or just last night, he ran into my husband's casita. He has a little man cave casita in our backyard. He has movie chairs. My son ran and flipped upside down. He's moving his legs all over, which is so funny because, he's 14, so his legs are big and hairy and but he was acting like a little kid. It was so cute. And I looked at him, I said, "Oh, are you needing some input?" He said, "Oh, yeah." And vestibular input, if you need that, going upside down is the best way to fill that cup. I had mentioned in last episode, my vestibular cup is super teeny tiny. If I go upside down, like I did 2 days ago to pick up some socks underneath my bed, and I decided to go upside down off the side of my bed instead of get down on the floor, I couldn't handle it for very long. This just gives you information about what your brain can handle and about how the sensory systems developed, and then also what your preferences are. Okay, let's get into system number 4, and it is auditory, or also known as our hearing. This is sound. You may be someone who needs complete silence. I'm coaching a mom right now. She said before she had kids, she could be in the car by herself for hours and never turn the radio on. Now she has kids who are neurodivergent, who are loud and have intense behaviors. And she's now discovering, oh, wow, I need a break. It's not that I just want a break or it's meaning that I'm a bad mom. My body needs a break, especially from auditory input. If you have a big cup or your kid has a big cup, maybe they're constantly humming or are loud themselves or love noise, love to go to concerts or loud birthday parties, or we have all these indoor play places and entertainment places, Uptown Alley, Fat Cats. I don't know if you have these where you are. My sensory cup gets overfull within probably minutes in those places. It is so loud and so overstimulating because there's bowling going on and there's arcade machines, and then you have the people talking and there's music playing on top of that. And there's different music playing. There's music playing in the arcade, and then there's TVs playing in different parts. All of that noise is a lot for someone that has a really small cup. I know I was just talking about the big cup, but if you like those kind of environments, you probably have a pretty big auditory cup. And so your kids. Maybe you have a really small cup, or I have kids that can handle it when they're there. We know, my husband and I know that when we get home, we're going to need some decompression and some complete silence, no music. We always have music playing in our house. We need to have all of that off. And we might see some behaviors after the fact, not during. Again, just gives us some information and understanding of what we can handle, what our brains can handle, what they can't, and how to start giving our brains what it needs to be able to, what's called, again, integrate these systems. Here's a paradox that confuses a lot of parents, is that you might have a kid who needs to wear headphones out in public or at concerts or even at school or assemblies or something like that. And I love that that seems to be something more accepted now. When you see someone with headphones, you don't, oh, maybe you do, but I don't make judgments about them anymore. It seems to be more of a common thing. Oh, sounds are hard for that kid, or sounds are hard for that adult. What's interesting though, a lot of times these kids that need to wear the headphones are the loudest kids. They love to make noise themselves. It feels kind of contradictory, right? Research explains what's happening. And so once you understand this, you might not see this again in the same way. I have very, very loud children who make extremely loud noises. And the son that I talked about at the very beginning of this episode, who we couldn't even go into a public restroom because the toilets were going to be so loud and unexpectedly, because he didn't get to control when he flushed it. They decided to flush on their own. And it's extremely loud noise, especially in a public restroom. Usually it's very echoey and the toilets seem to be louder than your toilet at home. There's probably lots of reasons for that. However, that kid can be so incredibly loud himself. Here's the science. The brain processes sound it creates very differently than the sound it receives. I'm going to say that again. The sound that a person is creating, the brain receives that differently than the sound that's coming in through your ears. There's lots of research in this and lots of, neuroscience journals, and they found that self-generated sounds evoke a smaller brain response than externally generated ones. And this is called sensory attenuation. Say that twice or 3 times or 4 times. Sensory attenuation. Basically, your brain softens the volume of sounds you make because it's predicting that it's coming. This is the same reason why you can't tickle yourself. Have you ever tried to tickle yourself? Like, I can do this and just it be fine. If you're not listening, I'm like tickling my armpits. If someone else tried to tickle my armpits, I would lose my mind. Same thing. The brain is already predicting it's happening. And so in the auditory domain, self-generated sounds lead to smaller brain responses compared to externally generated sounds. What's happening is the brain essentially turns down the dial on its own noise because it's not a surprise. Then you have kids who are auditory avoidant. That part of the brain that receives and filters noise is working differently. It pays way more attention to sounds than it needs to and has difficulty ignoring the background sounds. Unpredictable sounds from the outside world can feel super amplified, startling. It can even be painful. I find this so fascinating that the kids who can almost feel pain because of too much noise are the ones that need to make a ton of noise. Isn't that so fascinating? And it's because their nervous system can predict it and their nervous system can control it. Therefore, they can tolerate the noise. And also, this is important to note, is if they're humming, making weird, random animal noises. I have a friend's son who was getting in trouble at school for making animal noises in the classroom. I told her, oh my gosh, he's brilliant. His body knows he needs to regulate. And this kid, I think, doesn't like loud noises from other people, but he loves to make noises himself. The humming, the singing, the talking, making gurgling noises. This is super fascinating, is what they're doing is activating their vagus nerve, which helps calm down their nervous system. It turns on the brakes in their nervous system. Kids are so incredibly intuitive. I was just talking to a dad this morning in a coaching session, and he was sharing how he was frustrated that the kids were doing things that ended up with them getting hurt. We unpacked it that it was definitely a sensory need from both of them. He ended up giving them heavy work without realizing what he was doing and helping them meet their needs. He stopped, looked at me, and said, oh my gosh, these kids are so smart. Yeah, they're very intuitive and know what they need. And then us adults come along and know better and try to stop their bodies from getting what they need to feel okay. And then we wonder why they have crazy behavior problems. This is why I love talking about the sensory systems. It helps us understand so much of what's going on or why we need to stop stopping or stop keeping them from moving their bodies, making noises. Now, there is a time and a place, and sometimes they can't do those things, right? However, it's really important that we're proactive and help them get these needs met outside of those moments where they can't meet their sensory needs. Also, auditory hypersensitivity is really more of an emotional based problem connected to the auditory system and the limbic system. The limbic system is our emotions, and that's the emotional like center of our brain. And so making their own sounds isn't triggering the alarm system in the same way that external sounds are. And in fact, it can help them regulate. Does that make sense? I could probably spend an entire episode on this very topic. The next sensory system we're going to cover is visual. You probably are familiar with the word visual, and that is our sight sense. This is more about just seeing clearly. There is so much information and messages coming in through our visual sense, and our brain is processing crazy amounts of input. If you have a big cup or you have a child with a big cup, they love flashing lights or spinning objects. Or I have a friend, her son could sit and watch my van doors open and close and open and close. She always joked that she could leave him in front of a store that had automatic doors and he would stay there. It didn't matter how long she shopped for. She did not do that, especially when he was younger, maybe as he got older, because he loves the visual stimuli. He loves that input that he's getting from watching the doors open and close. Glitter in bottles, ceiling fans, busy environments. These kids have really large visual cups. Now, a small cup would be squinting in bright places, not being able to handle, going out into the sun. That's my middle son. When he first started learning about this, he's like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. I mean, his eyes will even tear up. And we live in a very, very sunny, bright place. Maybe you have a child that prefers simple, dim environments. They don't like a lot of light, or they can't handle clutter. This is me. I will have this alarm system going off in my head. Oh, clutter, 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 clutter. And then I start to feel very anxious in my body. And then I start decluttering and start cleaning. And so this gives you a little sense of the visual sense if you have a big cup, a small cup, or an average size cup. This can also help you understand if you have a kid who struggles with technology and screens. Imagine how much stimulation their brain is getting from all of the colors and sights. And I mean, it also is associated with dopamine and serotonin and all these things in our brains that can really burn a brain out. If you have a kid who loses their mind after watching a ton of TV or movies or play video games, they could have a smaller sensor or visual sensory cup, and it's just too much. Or even just the blue light alone. There's a lot of research that supports that we're not meant to have this much blue light in our eyes, especially at nighttime, because it basically is telling the brain it's daytime, even though it's not daytime. Lights have really challenged our circadian rhythms for sure. Again, that's another topic for another day. We are going to get now into system number 6, which is olfactory. You might not be familiar with this term. Olfactory is simply your smell sense. And it has the strongest connection to, you guess it, memory and emotions. And it's basically a direct pathway to your brain's emotional center. It can instantly change your mood. When I first had my first son, I used, what is it, Love Spell by Victoria's Secret. I think that's what it's called. I would use that. I call it germ juice. What is that? Antibacterial soap stuff, before and after I would change diapers. And that smell brings me back to that time. And that time was hard for me. I was a brand new mom, didn't have a lot of friends with kids, had no idea what the heck I was doing. And he had a lot of sensory needs, even as a brand new baby. And I didn't know what any of this stuff meant or what he was needing. I just knew that I needed him to be able to not be held or moved or or swung and that I needed some breaks. And so that smell brings me back to that moment and I start to feel anxiety in my body, even though I have not used any products with that smell for years and years and years. Super fascinating how that works. If you have a big cup for olfactory, that could be you love smells, or maybe it's certain smells. There are certain that smells that I love, mints or cinnamon, hazelnut. I love those kind of smells. Maybe you don't like other smells. Maybe you have a small cup for other smells. A small cup too could be if you feel sick with very strong smells. My son's music place, it's great that they clean it. You can tell that they clean it well because whatever product they use, I can't even sit in there because it makes me feel sick. I have a small sensory, olfactory. Yeah, olfactory sense. Now we're going to talk about the seventh sensory system, and we're going to end there for this episode. We'll save the eighth for the last episode in this series. Sensory system number 7 is gustatory. Another fun word. Gustatory is taste. A lot of people, when they start to learn this, realize, oh, it's probably connected to picky eating. For my son, it's not just about gustatory for him. For him, I think it's actually visual. He can't even process what it looks like to get it into his mouth. Once we get it into his mouth, and sometimes this has taken years for him to try a food, he is fine. I don't think it's gustatory. But for your kid, if they are picky with what foods they eat, it could be because they have a super small gustatory cup. And it's more than just taste, it's about texture, temperature, the feel in their mouth, the flavor intensity. If you have a really tiny gustatory cup, it might take the smallest amount of flavor to send your taste buds into, oh, this is too much. Or if you know someone, or maybe you're this person, that has a really large gustatory cup, they can eat, or you can eat very spicy foods or foods with really, really big, robust flavors. That means you probably have a big sensory cup preference. Other small cup examples are people who prefer plain food, or they might gag as certain textures and just can't do it, or they need to have their food separated. I was that kid. I did not like my food touching on the plate. All of the food had to be separate. I also had to complete one food before I would move on to the next. Now I notice I don't do that anymore. That's the thing about sensory preferences is they change as the brain integrates, as the brain realizes, oh, this really isn't that bad, or it gets all the input it needs to be able to grow and change and create what it needs. I'm not going to get into the neuroscience of it as I tend to do. And so I don't do that anymore. And same with my son in the flushing toilets. He can now go into a public restroom. He's 9 and has no issues. He doesn't have to ask about the robots. He's not feeling anxious because a toilet's going to flush on him, or even with his quote unquote picky eating. I don't like to label things that because then we put our kids into that bucket. And so he's very selective with what foods he eats. And I can say it's gotten a lot better. My middle son used to not eat very many foods. It had to be just fruits and vegetables and things that look the way that they do in nature. I don't think they ever verbalized that, but it's how it was for both of them. And when he was about 8 or 9, because of the raining taco song on the Lego movie, he asked for tacos. And ever since then, he has been so willing to try foods. Now he will say, okay, I don't like this. And he'll be able to recognize because it is the texture or the color, or real, for him, it's not very visual. He will recognize if it's the flavors are too intense, or if it is the texture of the food. However, he is super willing to try anything and everything. I did not think that would ever be the case because it was so hard for him to try foods. And then, of course, we don't mean to, but we compare to the other siblings because my oldest, he was eating raw spinach and avocados as a 2-year-old. He would eat anything. And still to this day, at 16, he will eat anything and everything as long as it's consumable. That boy will eat it, especially at 11 o'clock at night. Okay, so we went through, so that was the small cup and then the large cup for gustatory. I kind of talked about this, but if you're a kid or you really like spicy food, sour food, crunchy, anything that has an intense intensity to it as you eat it, then that typically means you have a larger gustatory cup. If you have a kid with a super tiny gustatory cup and it doesn't seem like you're ever going to get them to eat anything, remember stress makes sensory processing much harder if you're forcing them to eat it. I have memories of having to sit at the table for a very long time. In my memory now, it felt like hours, but I don't think it actually was hours. That's the tricky thing about memory. And I didn't like what was on the plate, and I had to sit there and force myself to eat it. That causes stress on the system and makes it much harder for that sensory system to integrate and to be able to handle things and come more into that, middle normal size cup. And so, with all that to say, keep exposing them, do it in low pressure ways. There's lots of resources out there. I have one that's coming to mind. I can't think of what it's called, but I'll put it in the show notes. And so today we talked about so many different sensory systems. We talked about visual processing, auditory processing, olfactory, gustatory, so sight, hearing, smell, taste, and how that impacts the way we show up as humans. And if you're not sure, do I have a small cup? Do I have a large cup? Or I don't know what all of these different sensory systems are. That's why I created the sensory profile. You can grab it from the link in the show notes, download it. I highly recommend that you fill one out for everyone in your family and maybe revisit it every so often because, again, our cup changes or our cup sizes change. I can think of how I could not handle certain things and now it's not too bad. Or now I know how to accommodate myself. If I go into a very loud entertainment place with bowling and golf and music and arcade games and, and it's usually dark. I don't know why those places are so dark and there's not a whole lot of light and I have a big visual cup and I want natural light. I know that I'm going to need some accommodations. I will bring earplugs or I will step outside every once in a while. And now I feel like our kids don't melt down as much after the fact because we've accommodated them as well. And remember, it's okay to push a little bit, not push, that's the wrong word. It's okay to see what your kid can handle. And if you feel like my kid has huge cups in areas, super tiny cups in other areas, or tiny cups in everything. They are avoidant to all sensory input that's coming into their body. I highly recommend finding an OT that specializes in sensory integration and they can come alongside you and give you some exercises and things that you can do with your kids. There's also books there. We have one book called The Sensory Diet, I believe. I'll put a link in the show notes. And it just helps you see what your kid is needing for their brain to feel okay. And as always, I do a lot of this work inside my Purpose Parent Transformation Program. And if you are wondering if it's a good fit or if you would like more support in your parenting, especially if your kids have some big sensory challenges, or now you're realizing that you do too, then you can snag a time on my calendar by going to raisingkidswithpurpose.com/chat. I can't wait for our last episode in this series, and we're going to be talking about something called interoception. Another big word for you. Now go raise those kids with purpose.